Welcome to the Unstressed Exec, the podcast where we dive deep into the real conversations that help you lead, love, and live with greater clarity, courage, and calm. I'm your host, Dr. George Vergolias, executive coach and clinical forensic psychologist, and I help high-achieving professionals navigate life transitions, resolve conflict with confidence, and build unshakable psychological resilience. So if you're ready to lead with purpose, master conflict with grace, and become more emotionally agile under pressure, you're in the right place. Let's get started. Welcome back to episode number 6 of the Unstressed Exec podcast. I'm Dr. George Vergolias, executive and resilience coach, forensic psychologist, and guide for these deeply important conversations around leadership, well-being, and personal evolution. This episode marks the second episode in our Men's Mental Health Awareness Month series. If you haven't listened to episode 5 yet, I highly encourage you to check it out. In that episode, we covered cultural silence surrounding men's mental health and how we can all better support the men in our lives. Today, we're going deeper, beneath the silence, to explore the barriers that stand between men and the help that they need. Because if we don't understand why men aren't reaching out, why they're falling through the cracks, and why so many suffer in silence, then we can't expect real change. And as we've seen in the data, change is desperately needed. So let's hop in and start with talking about the data behind the disconnection. And let's start with what the numbers are telling us. So a few key insights from the data. Number 1, men account for nearly 80% of all suicides in the US. Secondly, although men are significantly less likely to receive a diagnosis of depression or anxiety, not because they don't struggle, it's because they don't really show up to therapy or primary care appointments when they might be screened. We also know the National Institute of Mental Health reports that only about 1 in 4 men who experience mental health difficulties seek professional help. That's a pretty low percentage compared to the amount of men that need help, and when you compare it against the amount of men that commit suicide every year. And as New York University marketing professor Scott Galloway has highlighted in multiple interviews and writings recently, and most specifically in a Vox interview, we are witnessing a quiet epidemic amongst men. He calls it male drift, a kind of slow detachment from community, purpose, education, and relationships. They're really just drifting away. And we're going to get into a little bit more of that data shortly. Galloway notes that for the first time in U.S. history, women are outpacing men in college graduation rates, workforce engagement, and even home ownership under the age of 30. Meanwhile, men are more likely to be isolated, addicted, unemployed, and unpartnered. So the question we're driving into today is this: what is keeping men from getting help? So to start or kick off our discussion to lend insights to that or answer that question, we're going to open with personal and family barriers, which seem to be one of the more prominent difficulties that men bump into. And we're going to start at the ground level, the personal and family systems that many men grow up in. From a young age, most boys are taught directly or subtly that emotional expression is suspect. Sadness is weakness, crying is feminine, anger is allowed, but grief is not. It's okay to lose your shit and throw things around or get angry or even get in a fist fight when you're a boy, but crying, unacceptable. And we wrap that up in phrases like, be a man. Prove you're a man. Show you're a man. Stop crying. Stop being a little girl, right? But what does that even mean, the statement, be a man? For many men I've worked with, whether it's executives, combat veterans, fathers, young professionals, being a man has meant suppressing emotion. It's meant solving problems silently. It's meant only reaching out for help when the house is metaphorically or literally on fire and burning down. Family dynamics will often reinforce this. If your dad never talked about his feelings, or if your mother inadvertently told you to toughen up every time you were sad, you learned that vulnerability was dangerous. In fact, it was even shameful. And shame, by the way, is one of the most powerful silencers in psychology. Shame is one of the most powerful motivators to get us to be quiet, to not express, and to turn inward. In my clinical experience over 20 plus years, as well as my coaching experience, shame is the biggest internal barrier to healing. And for many men, it goes completely unspoken. But in additional to the family dynamics that we grew up in, we kind of enter our teens and then eventually enter our young 20s in a certain mindset based on those family dynamics and the messages we received. We then enter the workforce. And so what are some of the workforce barriers that we then start encountering in our 20s and 30s and so on? And we're going to shift to that. So, when we think of the world of work, it's a place where many men tie their identity, their value, and often their emotional stability to that. It's another reason why so many men struggle when they retire or when their children leave the home. In corporate cultures, especially in high-performance environments like law, finance, technology, or medicine, there is kind of an unspoken rule. And that rule is don't bring your emotions to work. Now, I do think some corporations, I do a lot of consulting at the corporate level, a lot with C-suite executives. And I do think that sentiment of don't bring your emotions to work is slowly changing over time. There's certainly openness of challenging that. I don't know, though, if at a cultural absorption level, it is really driven down into the cultures yet. So there's a lot of talk about it. There's a lot of lip service given to it. It has kind of, by way of osmosis and intentionality, it kind of steeped its way through culture yet in the workplaces, but we'll see. I've coached a lot of executives who say things like, if I open up about what I'm dealing with, I'll lose credibility. They'll think that I'm unstable, or I can't be seen as weak, there's too much at stake. I work also with a number of lawyers and law firms, and there's a real concern that if I open up and express psychological or emotional vulnerability, I'm going to be put off partner track, or I'm going to lose my ability to advance. And these fears are not unfounded, right? While mental health stigma has improved in recent years, many organizations still lack meaningful systems of support. They have few, or very few, I should say, offer male-specific mental health programs. Many managers are uncomfortable initiating mental health check-ins. They don't know how to bring these discussions up. They don't know how to navigate these discussions. And some HR structures unintentionally penalize vulnerability by flagging high performers who suddenly request mental health leave. So they feel like they've been essentially punished. And then their coworkers that notice that reaction, what's the signal that they get or the messaging that they get is you need to go quiet. You need to be quiet and silent about these struggles. So what happens with men as well is we bury it, right? We show up, we put on a mask, we grind harder, and we do this until we burn ourselves out, until we implode, or until we just quiet quit or just quietly resign. And the irony with this pattern is that when these men do get help, when we do go to therapy or coaching or even just open up to a peer, often the response back is, I wish I had done this sooner, or I didn't know it was okay to feel this way. And so we spend weeks, months, in some cases years, unnecessarily suffering. And not only we are suffering, but the people around us are suffering. Because the flip side of this is true. When men are living an emotionally healthy and vibrant mental health life, the people around us do better. And that's the same for women. And so that's probably a good time or segue for us to kind of expand out to talk about societal and cultural norms as it relates to this larger discussion. So as we zoom out further, we have to acknowledge that larger culture often shapes these experiences. Many of our societal stories about manhood are outdated. They're still rooted in industrial age ideals of the provider, the stoic protector, the emotional rock. We still hear this today. And while there is a lot of truth in male identity and masculinity and the importance of being able to provide and protect, I think those are strong values. I don't think we should throw those out. I think the difficulty is we have aligned those values of being the provider, the protector, the emotional rock with you can't talk about these things. You're not allowed to struggle. You're not allowed to admit these emotional faults or weaknesses. And that's where we go wrong. We could still be the provider, the protector, the emotional rock. We can still strive to be those things while also having a space and an opportunity to show emotional vulnerability. And the irony with this is in the medical field. Any of us know that if you break your leg, anyone in our life would say, go to the doctor, go to the hospital, get this treated. You need to allow time for this weakness of your broken leg to heal. And yet when it comes to emotional breaking, None of us say that. I don't want to say none of us, but we have a long way to go until the culture adopts that same messaging. So we get it organically. We understand it in physical illness, but we don't really give it the same support or value in the emotional psychological realm. Even our media reflects this. How many movies feature emotionally nuanced male characters who don't resolve their pain through violence or avoidance? Another way to say that is, how many movies or TV shows show very strong, emotionally put together men that solve their problems through talking it through emotional vulnerability, through emotional intelligence, through working things out verbally? There's examples, but there's not a lot. A lot of the protagonist main male characters are solving their problems through violence or avoidance or diving into the bottle, right? It's just not many. And let's not forget how culture intersects with race, religion, nationality. In many immigrant or religious households, therapy is still seen as a taboo. Expressing mental distress can be viewed as a moral failure or a spiritual weakness. And in many cases, particularly in very traditional Asian or Indian cultures, it can be seen as a shameful thing on the family, or like a shameful representation of the family that you had to seek help from somebody outside. Now, again, I think that is changing over time with greater awareness and acknowledgement of these problems, but we still see it. And you will still see that even in earlier generations of immigrant families. So first generation families often have more difficulty expressing these feelings and seeking help outside the family versus second, third, or fourth generation when there's been more assimilation into the American culture. For Black men, Indigenous men, Latino men, the barriers are compounded by generational trauma, systemic discrimination, and often underrepresentation in the mental health field. There's just not a lot of men from these backgrounds doing therapy or doing executive or life or resilience coaching. They're out there. And I think many are doing exceptional work, but they're not easy to find. So even if a man wants to talk, even if he wants to open up, he may not know where to go, who to talk to, or whether he'll even be understood when he gets there. These are real barriers at the societal and cultural level. And in addition to that, though, we also have systemic and economic barriers. So this is kind of our fifth category, right? So let me kind of rehearse the categories. We looked at the data behind the disconnection. We then looked at personal and family barriers to men reaching out and getting help. We then looked at workplace barriers. And then we looked at societal and cultural norms as another round or set of barriers that men often encounter. But what about the systemic and economic barriers? Because they're real. And sometimes they're the most significant barriers that men face. And in some ways, this is kind of a policy discussion as well, right? The nuts and bolts around access or accessibility. Here's what we know. Therapy is expensive for most people. Insurance often doesn't fully cover mental health care, especially not long-term therapy. Wait times are long, especially for men of color seeking culturally competent providers or providers that understand their perspective or their worldview. And I'm going to say a quick aside to that point, because I think it's something I feel strongly about. Provided that a therapist or a coach has the right or the requisite skills to do the job, I think it can be very helpful to find cultural matching. So you feel like somebody understands your worldview and your unique perspectives, whether it's someone from the LGBTQ community or a man of color or a man like a veteran who's been through combat. All of these are reference points that if your provider or coach understands these, it can help without a doubt. There's a flip side to that too, though, because sometimes in therapy or coaching, working with somebody that is from a different perspective and that can bring a new or broader or different perspective to the work can also be helpful. So I don't want you hearing this line where I said that wait times are long, and especially men of color seeking culturally competent providers is a barrier. While that can certainly be a barrier, I don't want any of you to think that, well, if I can't find the exact kind of therapist that matches my own cultural background, therapy will be a joke or coaching won't help. There's some very profound work that can be done with a competent therapist or coach that has a different background than you. So just keep that in mind. There's some really powerful work that can be done there. There's another kind of category of economic barriers, and that is rural areas often have little to no access to in-person mental health support. Now, since the pandemic hit a few years ago and the widely and rapid adoption of telehealth psychotherapy or telehealth therapy has occurred, that has really expanded access to rural areas, but it's still a problem for in-person mental health support. And that's just a reality. And some people may not have the technical sophistication, they may not feel comfortable, or they just may not like the telehealth engagement and they really want in-person support, and that can be hard to find. Even in places where therapy is technically available, many men don't know how to start. There's no really roadmap or guidepost that allows them to enter into that world. And guess what? Men are less likely to have regular primary care doctors to begin with. That means that there are fewer opportunities for mental health screenings or referrals. And this is where we need to kind of improve public health campaigns, mental health education in schools, and stronger integration between medical or primary care and mental health services. Because for most men, some don't even engage their primary care doctors. Many do, but that's the extent of it. So if you're not reaching them at the primary care level for mental health services, you may not be reaching them at all. So educating primary care doctors and making the linkage between those doctors and mental health providers strong and improving the ease of use and improving the engagement and connectivity, that's going to be key as we go forward. The other thing we need to do is train providers, psychologists, therapists, coaches in gender-sensitive approaches. Because let me tell you, men process emotions differently. It's not worse. It's certainly not often better necessarily, but it's just different. And our systems need to reflect that. There are long-time studies going all the way back to the work of Carol Gilligan in the 70s, 80s, and so on, where she has identified, and by the way, this research has evolved over time, so I don't want to date, and anchor the research back then, but she was pivotal in simply identifying that men and women do tend to think differently about emotional expression. Women tend to be more expressive and more open to sharing around that, and it doesn't mean that men don't have emotions. We have a mountain of emotions. The difference is men tend to only show the top level of those emotions, with a lot that goes buried underneath the surface. And our systems need to reflect that as well. There's also some insights I think that we can kind of garner here or grab onto here. I talk a lot about Scott Galloway, the New York University professor of marketing, because he has really looked at data around how men are struggling. And he's been quite eloquent in making a case for not only that struggle, but how that struggle affects all of us. It doesn't just affect men. It affects children. It affects people in our families. It affects women. It affects the larger system as a whole. And there are some really alarming trends. I opened with some of that, but I will continue all throughout this month of June to talk a lot about some of Galloway's insights. So he's been especially vocal about this. And he's framing it as a crisis, and it's both cultural and economic. He talks about how boys are falling behind in education, only accounting for roughly 40% of college enrollments today. We clearly represent close to 50% of the population, but only 40% of college enrollment. That 10% difference is big. He highlights how male labor participation is declining, not just because of automation. A lot of times people think, well, that's AI, that's automation. Nope, it's not only automation. It's also because many men feel disenfranchised. There are millions and millions of men in the 20s and 30s that are just disengaged from the workforce as a whole. They're not only not working, they're not looking. Mike Rowe, the host of one of the kind of famous work shows where he goes around and he shows really difficult jobs, he will talk a lot about this. He's another voice of advocacy for this growing crisis. And part of that with men feeling disenfranchised, again, not just not working, they're not even looking at this point. They are also disconnected from a sense of purpose and a sense of meaning, and they're lacking a sense of community. Because the reality is most of us wake up on a Monday and we wish we didn't have to work. But when any of us are actually out of work for a sustained period of time, it is a absolute beatdown on our ego. And it's not just about finances. It's also about the purpose and the meaning and the empowerment and the agency that work provides us. That sense that at the end of the day, we're contributing to something and we're getting something done. Work is a powerful motivator. It's a powerful boost to our sense of competence and our ego. And when you remove that, man, meaning, purpose, sense of community all significantly decline. Here's a great quote by Galloway. When men feel like society no longer has a place for them, they check out, sometimes quietly, sometimes violently. And as an expert, one thing I don't talk a lot about, I will in future episodes. I'm a clinical and forensic psychologist. In addition to being an executive coach, I'm also a certified threat manager, which means I've been certified by the Association of Threat Assessment Professionals as a workplace violence mitigation and threat assessment expert. I have been evaluating and intervening with workplace violence threats and mass shootings for 20 years now. And one thing I will tell you is when men feel disenchanted or disenfranchised, they lack meaning, they lack purpose, they lack a sense of community, and you sprinkle on just a few additional risk factors, you've got a increased risk pool of somebody that is perhaps moving on a trajectory of solving their problems through violence. This is the risk kind of personality, if you will. I don't want to use the term profile, but this is the risk personality for somebody that's going to bring a gun back to the workplace. And they're going to find their solution at the end of a gun. That's a real problem. And we need to listen to that because what we're seeing is not just a mental health issue, it's a societal health issue. Again, I'm going to say that. It's a societal health issue that we need to address and think of. So let me recap some of the barriers and I always end my podcast with a certain call to action. So the barriers that we've discussed today are internalized stigma and shame, family norms that suppress emotion, workplace cultures that punish vulnerability, societal stories that equate manhood with stoicism, and then systemic gaps in access, affordability, and inclusivity. Today, I'm not going to go into an exhaustive discussion of how we solve all those. I will in future episodes, but the cost of ignoring these barriers is massive. It's not just for individual men. It's for families, organization, communities, women, across our whole societal tapestry. But there is some good news. These barriers are not immovable. They can be dismantled, conversation by conversation, policy by policy, and one act of courage by another. That's how we begin to do it. We have the courage to dialogue, we have the courage to increase our awareness, and we have the courage to step up and say we need to make changes at each of these levels. So here's my challenge for you for the next week. If you're a man listening right now, ask yourself, what's one story about manhood I've internalized that no longer serves me? I'm going to say that again. What's one story about manhood that I've internalized that no longer serves me? Another way to maybe think of that is, what messages and ideas about manhood am I carrying around that are not working for me anymore? Is it the things we talked about earlier, right? Subject your feelings, don't cry, men don't show emotion, right? And how is that working for you? So that's the first question. If you're a leader in the workplace environment, right, or in a corporate environment, how can your workplace make emotional support more visible and acceptable for men? What can you do? It's interesting. There's a lot of groups I see at the corporate level, not only where I've worked historically, but also I've seen a lot in the consulting I do at the corporate level, at all levels, especially senior VPs in the C-suite level. There's a lot of different groups for women. There's groups for minorities. There's groups for the LGBTQ community. There's diversity and inclusion groups. And all of those are critical to help people feel comfortable and supported and feel like they have a voice in the workplace. I don't know off the top of my head if I can name any that have groups for men or a men's group. So it's an interesting question if you're a leader. How can your workplace make emotional support more visible and acceptable for men? And then the last challenge, if you're a partner, a friend, a sibling, or just an ally to a man, what small action can you take this week to make it safer for a man in your life to open up? I posted something the other day on TikTok. My TikTok handle and my Instagram handle is the Unstressed Exec. Would love you to go over there and give me a follow. I think on both of those platforms, it's the.unstressed.exec. You should be able to find me. But I just posted something where I had a dishwasher repairman come just yesterday in my house, and he was running late. And in running late, he was super apologetic. And you could tell that he was used to patrons or customers being really pissed off when he's late. He mentioned to me in saying, I'm so sorry, I was running late. I'm under a lot of stress. He's like, I'm trying to manage the household. My wife just passed away suddenly and unexpectedly in April. Here we are in June. So it was just a few months ago. And as he told me this story, because I was listening, right? I was not just curious. I was compassionate. I was interested. He teared up. And one thing that struck me so much is how he really didn't have a whole lot of people. He didn't have many people to talk to. He didn't have many people that he can share and express to. And those he did were his daughters or his sisters or women in his life. But what was so clear to me, he had no men that he could really go to. And it struck me how sad that was. And his wife died suddenly. She had I believe, an aneurysm, and she basically had a stroke, and it happened right in front of him. And he was doing CPR, and he was explaining to me how he was on the phone with 911. And this was a traumatic, sudden event. And he was tearing up, and you could see the emotionality. And this poor guy had, again, he has some support, which is good, but he has no men in his life at scale or at a level of depth that he can really talk to. So if you are a friend, a sibling, a brother, a sister, an ally, a partner, a loved one, a spouse, a girlfriend, what small action can you take this week to make it safer for a man in your life to open up? And in that post that I just kind of described, I highlight, especially if you're a woman in that man's life, yes, he will need some space and time. You want to give him space and time, right? They're not going to readily talk about things, but don't let him drown in that space and time. Don't let him drown in it. Give him some space, but continually reach out and just be there and be ready for when he's able to open up, be ready for it and be responsive to it. Because most men are not going to do it. We're just not going to do it naturally. Those of us that have done the deep work, and some of us have, yeah, we will. And yes, we've even maybe built our own tribes for that kind of male and masculine support. But those men that have not done that work, and most men have not, by the way, they're just not organically going to reach out. So again, what steps can you take to be that safe voice, that safe ear in that man's life? All right, that's it for today. Thank you for showing up for this conversation, and thank you for showing up for the men in your life who really need you most. In our next episode, I'm going to talk about getting beyond the color barrier and supporting the mental health of men of color and those from disenfranchised communities. I think it'll be a good discussion. You're not going to want to miss it because there's very unique barriers that men from those groups really encounter above and beyond all the stuff I've talked about in these recent episodes. So until then, I'm Dr. George Vergolias, the Unstressed Exec. You're listening to the Unstressed Exec podcast. Thank you for listening. See you next time. And remember, shift happens.